Good evening, everyone. My name is Crystal Regan, and I'm Chief Education Officer here at the North Carolina Museum of History. Thank you so much for joining us for this, our fourth episode of NC Community Class. We created this series with the goal of educating and engaging all citizens. This educational series aims to explore the historical contributions of various individuals and communities across our state and nation, and to connect those histories to the social and political issues that have and continue to impact these often underrepresented communities by examining them in a historical context. By bringing these historical figures and events and issues to the forefront, the series will encourage learning, conversation, awareness, and understanding. Tonight, we start season 2 of the NC Community Class program. For the next 3 months, we will explore topics related to the original nations and people of the great state of North Carolina. We've designed this theme for this season to complement and to set the stage for our American Indian Heritage Festival taking place in November. Tonight's program is on the Lumbee and Henry Berry Lowrie. Viewed by some as a hero and others as a criminal, Henry Berry Lowrie was a legend even before he disappeared in the swamps of Robeson County in 1872. A member of the Lumbee Tribe, Lowrie led a resistance against the Confederacy during the Civil War and later opposed the post-war Democratic power structure. The attempts to capture him and his gang became known as the Lowrie War. Many North Carolinians consider Lowrie a pioneer in the fight for civil rights. In this session of community class, a panel of scholars will provide insight into a world in which Lowrie and his gang emerged, as well as examine their legacy in the ongoing fight for social and political justice. But before we get started, just a few house rules. Ms. Michelle Carr, part of our public programs organization here, will be managing our chat. We invite you to participate by commenting and asking your questions. And some of those questions will be answered towards the end of the program at the end of our presentation. Please make sure that your comments and your questions are relevant and that they are respectful. Michelle will also be sharing other important information throughout the evening. If you are on social media, we invite you to use our hashtags NC Community Class and Lumbee History and share what we are doing here at the Museum of History. Now on to the good part. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have 3 presenters tonight, and I'll start with Ms. Nancy Strickland Fields. She's a member of the Lumbee Tribe and director and curator of the Museum of the Southeast American Indian at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. Previously, she worked at the National Museum of the American Indian, at the Smithsonian, and the Institute of American Indian Arts Museum. Dr. Lawrence Locklear is the director of the Office of Student Inclusion and Diversity and adjunct associate professor of American Indian Studies at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. A member of the Lumbee Tribe, he co-authored Hail to UNCP, a 125-year history of the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. We also have another member of the Lumbee Tribe, Dr. Melinda Maynor Lowry, and she has focused much of her work on questions of Native culture, identity, and migration. She is the Cahoon Family Professor of American History at Emory College of Arts and Sciences. The historian and documentary film producer was previously a history professor and director of the Center for the Study of the American South at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We are so excited to have these distinguished panelists join us tonight. Dr. Locklear, if you would take it away.
Crystal, thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I'm really excited to be here with my colleagues tonight and more importantly, talk with everyone a little bit about the history of the Lumbee people and Henry Berry Lowrie. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started because we've got so much we want to discuss tonight. I think we could probably talk for hours and hours and hours on end and just really address the tip of the iceberg. But for everyone listening tonight, thank you for joining us. I want to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to begin with just a short discussion of who the Lumbee people are. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Lumbee, Then we're going to provide a context for better understanding Berry Lowrie and the Lowrie War and the things that led up to that momentous event in Lumbee history. And then we're going to talk about the Lowrie War, and more importantly, what was the legacy of the Lowrie War and Berry Lowrie. And then we're going to wrap up with questions from those who are participating tonight. So I want to talk with you for a few minutes about the Lumbee people. And so before I talk about the people, I want to talk about place. You know, when you're talking about Lumbee people, we take our name from the river that we call home, and that river is the Lumbee River. It is legally designated as the Lumbee River, but to us, the people, we have always called it the Lumbee River. And so it winds through Robeson, Scotland, and Hope counties. And it's a very beautiful river if you ever had a chance to canoe it. But we use the river for a number of different ways to support our community. Use it for recreational purposes, religious purposes, social purposes. So it's a great place if you ever get a chance to canoe or kayak on the river. But in 1952, we, the people, decided that we wanted a name for ourselves. And for the first time since the arrival of Europeans, we had that opportunity to do that. And so in 1952, we held a tribal referendum, and we voted, and we adopted Lumbee as our tribal name. So we're really, really proud of that name. But along and beside the river is a series of swamps. And in Robeson County, those swamps actually became a place of refuge for the ancestors of the Lumbee people. And it was the place that we would build a nation. When colonials were encroaching upon Indian people, we sought a place to go hide. And for many of us, the best place to do that was in the swamps, because the British didn't see the swamps as a place with much value. But for Indian people, you know, we had traversed the swamps. We knew how to navigate the swamps. We knew how to hunt and fish and live and survive there. So for us, it was a natural place for us to go hide and start the building of the Lumbee Nation. And so for Lumbees who live there, and I'm attributing this to Dr. Melinda Maynor, it's a great quote. She said, for Lumbees who live there and whose ancestors are buried there, you know, we see the land as a blessing, and we truly do, because you can't not talk about Lumbee people and not talk about the river and the swamps and where we live. And so speaking of our tribe, Robeson County is covered in swamps, and Lumbee people define our place and where we live based on the swamp where we live. And so when you see this map of Robeson County on the screen, it shows where the three largest Lumbee communities were located in 1850. And when you look at the largest red circle, it's mostly around Bear Swamp, which is where the town of Pembroke is located today. But the upper circle is where the Saddle Tree community is at today. And then the lower circle is where the Fairgrove community is at, along Oldfield Swamp. So swamps, we use swamps still today to describe where we live. And speaking about our people, we are the largest tribe in the state of North Carolina. We are also the largest east of the Mississippi. And if I remember correctly, we're in the top 10 nationally in terms of size. There's approximately 70,000 Lumbees. And the majority of those live in Robeson County, but our tribal territory consists of Cumberland, Hope, Robeson, and Scotland counties in southeastern North Carolina. But we also have Lumbee communities outside of our tribal territory, and those are in Richmond County in North Carolina, Marlborough County across the state line in South Carolina. But we also have communities in urban areas, including Greensboro, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and a number of other places. So Lumbees are everywhere. So we can't go anywhere without running into a Lumbee. But there are certain surnames that are common to our community, and those include Locklear, Oxnine, Lowry, Hunt, Jacobs, Sweat, Maynor, Brave Boy, Cummings, you name it. If someone is from Robeson County and they have one of these names, I would bet my life that they are a member of the Lumbee community. So that's a great and easy way to identify some of our folks. But the communities that we live in, we have traditionally called where we live the settlement in Robeson County. But for folks who are not members of that community, outsiders, the name Scuffletown was given to that community. And so when you read the historical records from this period, you're going to hear them use the name Scuffletown, and it was meant as a derogatory term. And so when you hear that term, just know it's talking about the Indian community, but we ourselves call the community the settlement. But our historical communities are Prospect, Fairgrove, Saddle Tree, Union Chapel. Those are the oldest communities, but we have other more recent communities that were established. Those include Deep Branch, St. Anna, Smyrna, the town of Pembroke. Those are just a few of the communities, but a lot of folks today, again, still identify their community based on the swamp they live on. I live on Bear Swamp and have friends on Raft Swamp, Hog Swamp, Long Swamp, you name it. So that's the way that we identify where we live as a people. And so we've already talked about the importance of place. And so the other tenet that's critical to Lumbee identity is kinship. So, you know, when you introduce two Lumbee people to each other, the first question we're going to ask each other is, who's your people? And in that conversation, we're going to identify who we're related to and what community we're tied to, or where our community comes from, because that helps ground us in place. And so that's very important to who we are. And that's also important to the story of Berry Lowrie, because it is about place and it is about kinship. So I think that is a great way to segue into talking about Berry Lowrie. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Melinda Maynor Lowry.
Thank you, Lawrence. Would you unshare your screen, and then I can see you and Nancy, and I'll feel more at home.
There you go.
Thank you. I am just so thrilled to be able to speak to this wonderful audience tonight. And we have many tribal members on the call with us now. My mom is with us. Shout out to my mom. And Nancy and Lawrence, y'all are both my sort of guiding lights and beacons in many ways with Lumbee history. So I've been able to collaborate with you in different ways over the years, and just so happy to be here tonight doing this kind of one more time. We wanted to let y'all know that Henry Berry's story really begins with those swamps and those families that Lawrence just talked about. And in terms of historical time, I'm going to give a sort of 30,000 foot kind of overview of American history and the way that it relates to Lumbee community, and in particular, Henry Berry Lowrie's story. Henry Berry's story begins in many ways in the Tuscarora War. So the Tuscarora War took place in the early 1700s and was a conflict between Tuscarora Nation and the English settlers. It was a complicated event, but one of the key outcomes of it was to splinter Tuscarora families into several different groups. The other tribal ancestors of Lumbee people occupy this very large 44,000 square mile territory between the James River in Virginia and the Great PD River in South Carolina. There were dozens and dozens of tribal communities occupying that territory prior to the Tuscarora War. We think of the war as named as the Tuscarora War because the Tuscaroras were the largest, probably the most powerful Native community at that time in Eastern North Carolina, but they were not the only ones. And one of the outcomes of that war was for Tuscarora and other Native families to be splintered. Their relationships with their home places changed radically as a result of that event. Many Tuscarora people went north to join the Five Nations. They became the Sixth Nation in upstate New York. Other Tuscarora families went to the Indian Woods Reservation in Eastern North Carolina in Bertie County. And then there were many tribal communities who were allied with the Tuscaroras that also became some of our ancestors. So that place that Lawrence described that we had found safety in the midst of colonialism, it was an intense time after the Tuscarora War. Henry Berry Lowrie's great grandmother, a woman named Sally Kersey, was probably a Tuscarora Indian who was born at Indian Woods in Bertie County and who moved to Robeson County with the man that she married, James Lowry. Nancy's going to talk in a few minutes about the sort of Lowry family history and how that kinship group, those kinship relations lead up to and set the stage for Henry Berry's actions. But when Sally Kersey and James Lowry moved to Robeson County, it was right in the time period of the 7 Years' War. So the devastation wrought by the Tuscarora War, quickly upon that came this conflict between France, and Great Britain that was really played out in North America. And our ancestors, some of them Curseys, some of them members of other families, also took sides in that 7 Years' War. Some of them fought with the British, and some of them were just simply, again, trying to maintain their home communities in what we now know as Robeson County. The 7 Years' War had a impact on American history that many people don't really think a lot about. We think of American history in some ways as starting with the American Revolution, but the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, set a really important stage for the American Revolution, in particular because the British government, after the 7 Years' War, set up what was called a boundary line. They called it the 1763 Proclamation Line, after this proclamation, that declared that white settlers were not allowed to move west into the Ohio Valley, into the Appalachian Mountains. And the British government set up this boundary line in order to basically contain white European settlement. And they did that in an agreement with the native people who fought on their side and helped them win the French and Indian War. Some of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and others, made a great deal of money in the years leading up to the American Revolution, speculating, buying and selling land west of that proclamation line that was not theirs. It was not theirs to buy and sell. It was Indian land. It was owned, it was controlled, it was settled on by native people. But the people who became patriots, founding fathers of the United States, insisted that their victory in the 7 Years' War gave them the right, essentially, to buy and sell land that was not theirs. One of the grievances, important grievances, that is embedded in the Declaration of Independence is this complaint against the merciless Indian savages. So Thomas Jefferson, the other drafters of the Declaration, believed that one of the problems with British rule was that the Great Britain was actually supporting the independence or the sovereignty of Native American communities. Not only west of that boundary line, but folks like Lumbees and our ancestors who were still living east of that line were very busy sustaining our own independence, especially from this safe place that we had found among the swamps in the southeastern part of then the colony of North Carolina. So when Thomas Jefferson was talking about the merciless Indian savages, he was also talking about us. And he was also talking about the particular ways that Lumbee people decided to operate independently during the American Revolution. At that point, the records of that time period are really fascinating, and they tell us a lot about our river. They tell us a lot about the environment, because the Patriot Army and the British Tories, the local people who had still remained allied with Britain, they had a tremendously difficult time navigating these swamps during that war. And so in the records, our people appear again and again as obstacles to what the American patriots would like to happen, or what the British Tories would like to happen. And piecing through these records historically, we learn that it's really during the American Revolution that the Lumbee government, the Lumbee political community, as we now think of it today, began to form. They were forming around several sort of military figures, people who used the swamps, who knew them very well as a safe place, a place to hide out, a place to, if Patriot troops or Tory militia were stealing, this was not uncommon for troops in the American Revolution or the Civil War to raid farms, to steal provisions, and to essentially provide for themselves on local people. But if Tories or Patriots were overstepping their bounds, taking Lumbee property, Lumbee people became known for striking back. And they would do so from these safe places like Back Swamp, places like where Henry Berry's family eventually settled, and operated out of during the Civil War and the Lowry War. Back Swamp during the Revolutionary War was another place for Lumbee people to defend themselves from outsiders who were coming and taking the little bit that we had. The American Revolution was also a time when Lumbee people, because of our relationship to the British Crown and because of our relationship to some of the leaders of the state of North Carolina, were actually acquiring land. So many people ask, why are Lumbee still here, right? Why were we not sent off on the Trail of Tears or expelled or exported during the 1830s? And it's because during this time period of the American Revolution, many of our ancestors found a way to gain the deeds for the land that they lived on. Sometimes the land was granted to them. Now, it's pretty hard to grant land that you already own, but like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson believed that they could actually buy and sell land that wasn't theirs. The British king believed that he could grant land that wasn't his. So some of our ancestors have grants of land from the British king or from the state of North Carolina for certain other kinds of service. We have other Lumbee ancestors that served in the Patriot Army. Henry Berry's grandfather, for example, was one of these folks. But Lumbee people were gaining access to titles for their land during and after the American Revolution, which meant that by the time the federal government and the state of North Carolina was trying to remove Native people in the 1820s and 1830s, as they did with Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles, and other tribes throughout the nation, we owned land as individuals, as heads of households, in the same way that other European settlers owned land. So there was no legal way, unlike signing treaties or negotiating other kinds of agreements that led to removal, there was no real legal way for the state of North Carolina or the federal government to impose themselves on our communities again. They had imposed themselves so consistently from the Tuscarora War to the 7 Years' War to the American Revolution that our ancestors said, no more. They refused, essentially, to be imposed upon in that way again. And acquiring title to their land, securing property, was one way for them to refuse that kind of imposition. The American Revolution, I can answer questions about this later if folks are interested, but it also set up a situation where Native people in North Carolina were described as free persons of color rather than American Indians or as members of tribes or as in those sorts of ethnic or racial markers that we use today. The reason for that transition has to do everything to do with slavery. And it has everything to do with the way that slavery was a principle that the founding fathers were using to sustain their economies and to build the government. So as people were divided into groups of enslaved people and free people, if you were not Black and not white, but free, the legal category for you in North Carolina in, say, 1790, the year of the first census, was free person of color. And so as we go back again through these records and piece through all these things about Lumbee history, we don't always get to find our ancestors when we're looking for the label Indian in the records. We find them when we're looking for free persons of color, and especially when we're looking for those surnames that Lawrence mentioned a few minutes ago. So by the time the 1830s came around, and when Henry Berry is born in the 1840s, widespread expulsion of Native people is happening all over the Southeast, but not in Southeastern North Carolina. And that is partly because, for two reasons. One is the ideas about who belonged to an Indian tribe and what constituted an Indian tribe were changing. And the second reason is that ancestors of the Lumbees were owning their own property and their own land at that time. And it was impossible for the state of North Carolina or the federal government to figure out a way to alienate us from that land. And so we are still here today. And Nancy, I wonder if this is the moment for you to sort of fill in the Lowry family history over time.
Yes, that is actually a great setup. And also what I wanted to do with sharing a little bit of the history, and I'm kind of sticking with the men just for the sake of time and moving through several generations, is to look at Henry Berry Lowrie and how to kind of understand the actions of Henry Berry Lowrie and the Lowrie War as well. So you brilliantly just explained, kind of moving really from the early 1700s right up to the Revolutionary War. And so much happened during that 100-year period and the transitions of Native peoples. And so the Lowries were situated right in the center of the story. And so I want to start with James Lowrie. There are a lot of James Lowries in here, so it's kind of challenging sometimes to sort them all out. But there's actually a couple of previous Lowries before where we're going to start on this slide. But we're going to talk about James Lowrie in 1713, who is oftentimes in our local records referred to as James Sr. He's the one who kind of migrates down from Virginia into Robeson County, kind of following other relatives of ours that were kind of coming into this area from Virginia. He is the son of Judge Lowrie. There's another more complicated story there, James Judge Lowrie. But then you move down to who we're going to call James Jr. And James Jr. really has what I like to think of, and I kind of get these visual representations of these folks. I probably have watched too many historical fiction movies kind of thing, but he is in Robeson County in the 1700s. And I've put a little bullet here where on January the 5th of 1808, he is permitted to build a new road, right? In and around what they're calling his plantation, which really was probably a large working farm. We have a different kind of understanding of plantations by today's standards, but still a working farm. And so he's given permission to build a new road and then also asked to sustain an older road. And then an overseer is going to come in and kind of manage it, right? The way we might think of a highway patrolman today. I'm not sure if there were tolls on that road or not. That's a question for Melinda Maynor Lowry at another time. We always refer to her. But at any rate, so that's important, right? Because these roads weren't just used by Native people, but these roads were used by non-Native people in the community. And the fact that he is creating roads, in fact, the old Lowry Road is still within our community. He is a person of status. He has some connections to power here in Robeson County through government authorities. And so he's not, this disenfranchised Native person who's living among the community. He is actually creating infrastructure that the overall community is utilizing. So with that being said, he's also his farm or plantation is down by Mill Prong and McFall's Mill, which is the seat of this Revolutionary War center where the community is coming together, both as soldiers and military, but also the community and how they're debating about who's on what side. And so you see this mix of English and Scottish and Indian and even Black people discussing the politics involved in the American Revolution. And James Lowrie and his family are part of that. In fact, his son, William Lowrie, fights in the Revolutionary War, and he fights under Colonel Thomas Robeson, who the county is named after. And so right after, I think it's around 1790, the outcome of there's a disagreement, a political disagreement among the Lowries and the local community about the outcomes of the politics, if you will, really kind of tumultuous times as America is settling into its new identity. And so James Lowrie sells out to John Gilchrist. By the way, the Mill Prong house is still there today, and the Gilchrist Cemetery is just at the back of the property that you could visit. And that is where James Lowrie's house was just kind of really, lack of better terms, in the front yard is where it was originally located. what they decide to do is they decide to leave, right? Remove themselves from the pressure, and they move about 7 or 8 miles down the road, and they situate themselves on the Lumbee River, right at what would become Harper's Ferry. And he opens a tavern, and these were kind of, one can only imagine, this is like you're in a swamp, you're in the backcountry, you're kind of between South Carolina and the coastal plain, you're just coming out of the Piedmont. And so this is a place of respite for travelers. And it also served as a little, a tavern. You could have a drink there, you could get some groceries, rest a while. A little bit of local history is that it was called Harper's Ferry because of the newly established colonial law said that if you had overnight guests at taverns, then you had to provide them with entertainment. And so James Lowrie played the harmonica, which was then known as the mouth harp, and that's where the name Harper's Ferry comes from. And so we're not sure. We think it was either a bridge or a ferry at one time, and I'm not sure which came first. But at any rate, that's where he lived out his days. And then subsequently, William is there as well. It's important to mention that William gets this really horrific cut on his hand while he's fighting in the Revolutionary War. And it comes from James McPherson, who was from Laurel Hill. And supposedly these gentlemen kind of cross paths throughout their lives. And, William Lowry kind of used this big cut across his hand as his like battle cry for justice. And that, he was a proud patriot, right? He had fought on the American side. He had these really strong American values and believed in the community that he lived in, and was a upstanding citizen of the community. And he later received a pension for that injury that he received as part of the fighting in the American Revolution. So then we come to his son, Allen. So you've gone through these generations of men. We didn't get a chance to really touch on the women, but of these men who have, been part of this migration of indigenous peoples, white and indigenous peoples, who are coming into Robeson County together to start this kind of fresh new life out of Virginia. They get situated in the community. Now they're building roads and infrastructure. They're part of the really the triracial fabric of early Robeson County. They're fighting in the American Revolution. And then you have Allen Lowry. And Allen is understood to be another upstanding generation of the Lowry family. There's lots of texts that talk about how wonderful these people were. And you can also see during the time of Allen's life, particularly around the 1830s in North Carolina, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was around 1830, 1835, North Carolina disenfranchises, takes away citizens' rights of people of color, free people of color. We're not allowed to vote, to bear arms, and receive a public education. And it's about this time that Melinda has written wonderfully in an essay. Please pick up her books and her scholarship, but on the antebellum fringe, where it's written that here the Lowry family has attended Back Swamp Church even as far back as the 1770s. And then by the 1830s, Allen Lowry is being asked to move up to the balcony with enslaved people. And to him, that was a bit of an affront, right? He was upset about that. And so he left the church, and he ends up helping to establish a New Hope Church that's closer to their home community. But what we're seeing here, there's two big pivots here that are happening, really three. So you see James Lowry has pushed out of his community where he was, and now he's over at Harper's Ferry. You see William Lowry still kind of carrying through with these tensions after the Revolutionary War. Now North Carolina's disenfranchised free people of color, and there is a lot of ensuing racism and marginalization that continues to push forward through to what will become the Lowrie War. And I'm saying all of this as we're getting ready to jump into Henry himself, is to explore, a lot of people have wrestled with why did Henry as an individual or the members of the gang as individuals act in really extreme ways, in very violent ways. And I think if we look at Henry just as a case study, if you will, of the members of the gang, Henry is shouldering a lot of history, of really kind of declining experience among his community. His world was changing as he knew it. To come from this family that had migrated in with Tuscarora blood, gone through all of these experiences that Melinda had talked about, to being marginalized, to Alan being accused of being a thief, to not being an upstanding person of the community, and then to, subsequently, I know we're going to talk more about this, but Alan and his eldest son, William, are murdered by the Home Guard. That's a lot to land on a roughly 20-year-old young man, right? And so it was that kind of change over time, in not such a positive way, that I think really sort of enforces Henry's motives of why he acts the way he does, why he feels like he's really kind of pushed into a situation to where his actions are merited and justified in a way, but also in a way that he doesn't have anything to lose, because things are continuing to decline for Native peoples here in Robeson County, particularly as the Civil War is brewing up. So I'll stop there and hand it back over to Lawrence, and he can talk a little bit more about the coming Civil War. We have to do one, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. You think you would know this by now, but thank you, Nancy. So yeah, so now we're good. So Melinda and Nancy have sort of set up this scenario where you can begin to see that Native peoples, the racism, the discrimination, the marginalization has just been building and building and building. And in 1861, the Civil War starts. And historian McKee Evans said that, that at the start of the war, the wasting away of Indian status was continuing. And so during the war, Lumbee people supported mostly the Union Army, but there were some that actually supported the Confederacy. And we had Lumbees that served with both, if I remember correctly. And so when the war started, the Confederate Army gained control of Fort Fisher, which is located near present-day Wilmington, North Carolina. And as you see in the photo on the screen, it's a earthenworks fort, which means it's made out of sand. So you can totally understand it. It required a lot of labor to build and maintain that fort. And so initially the Confederacy used enslaved labor to build that fort, but plantation owners eventually said, no, we can't send our property to build this fort because of malaria, them dying, and so eventually the Confederacy learned of this large population of free people of color in Robeson County that are the Lumbee today. And they began the conscription of the Lumbee in 1862. And what conscription meant is that our men were forcefully removed from Robeson County, sent to Fort Fisher, and made to build the fort there. But many of these men, once they got to Wilmington or Fort Fisher and saw the working conditions and how bad it was, and many of them started escaping. And what they would do is they would come back to Robeson County and they would lie out in the swamps. And what I mean by that is they would literally hide out in the swamps. And while they were hiding, their family members, particularly their wives and their close family and other friends, would bring them food and anything else that they needed, because if they were captured by conscription officers, they could quickly and easily be returned to Fort Fisher. And then you would see that process repeat itself over and over again. So a large number of Lumbee men were just invisible in Robeson County. That didn't mean they were there, you just didn't see them. They were hiding in the swamps. And so many of these men, because they were hiding, they couldn't support themselves, they couldn't support their families. And so they began to raid wealthy landowners to get food and anything else that they needed to survive while hiding out in the swamps. But during that time, there were a number of oppressive Home Guard officials, and their sole purpose was to enforce local laws and also to secure provisions for the Army. But also during that time, there was a Confederate prison in Florence, South Carolina for Union soldiers. And a number of those Union soldiers escaped. And when they made their way north, it brought them directly through Robeson County. And in fact, Lumbees were known for harboring many of those escaped Union soldiers. So what that did was it set up this scenario where the Home Guard was really angry at Indian men who, one, had escaped from Fort Fisher, two, were robbing wealthy plantation owners, and three, they were harboring escaped Union soldiers. So what could be worse than that? And so the Home Guard really set out to clamp down on what these men were doing. And particularly, this is where the Lowry family comes in, because Alan Lowry's son, William, created what we call the Lowry gang today. And it was comprised of Alan's son, William, Henry, Steve, and Tom, some of their first cousins, a couple of former slaves, and a local white and an occasional Union soldier. And they were the ones robbing from these wealthy plantation owners. And so by the end of the Civil War, things had gotten really dangerous in Robeson County. And as the Civil War was winding down, you began to see this Lowry War. The tensions began to really build. So one conflict was coming to an end and another one was just getting started. And all that start of the Lowry War really began in December of 1864, when J.P. Barnes, who was a wealthy landowner, he was also a Confederate official, he accused some of the Lowrys of stealing his hogs. Barnes had earlier supported efforts to conscript Indians, and it ultimately led to this conflict with the Lowry gang in December of 1864. Henry Lowry, as far as we know, killed the first individual. The first shots were fired in this Lowry War, and so J.P. Barnes was killed by Henry Lowry. Well, 1 month later, James Brantley Harris was also killed by Henry Lowry. James Brantley Harris was a Confederate conscription officer. He was someone who was responsible for getting provisions for the army. He had somehow got involved into a quarrel with the Lowrys, and he encountered a Lowry, and he shot and killed this Lowry, not necessarily knowing in particular who this Lowry was. And as it turns out, the Lowry he killed was actually a first cousin to Henry Lowry. And surprisingly for the Indian community, Harris was not charged with Jarman Lowry's murder. And so Jarman had two other brothers. Their names were Wesley Lowry and little Alan Lowry. Both of them had been conscripted and sent to Fort Fisher, and they were allowed to come home on furlough. And while they were home on furlough, Harris ran into them. And, at this point, he's fearing for his life, because he knows the Lowrys had this gang and they're robbing folks. And so these two Lowry boys they come into his possession. He boards a train with Wesley and little Alan, and sometime later their bodies are found near the train depot in Moss Neck. They had both been beaten to death with a lighter knot. Everyone knew that James Brantley Harris did it. So of course, Harris wasn't again charged with their two murders. And so Indian community was really upset. And ultimately, Henry Lowry vowed to seek revenge for the murder of his three first cousins. And eventually, sometime later, a week or two later, Henry Lowry did kill Harris. And so with the murder of J.P. Barnes and James Brantley Harris, two conscription officers, the local Home Guard had finally had enough. They had had enough of the robbing of the plantation, the murders, the harboring of escaped Union soldiers. And in March of 1865, the local Home Guard rounded up Alan Lowry and William Lowry. Alan was Henry Berry's father. William was Henry's brother, and William was the leader of the gang at that time. Ultimately, the Home Guard executed Alan and William, and supposedly, according to Lumbee oral histories, Henry Lowry saw their murders and he vowed to seek revenge against anyone who had to do anything with their deaths. And ultimately, that was the beginning of what became the Lowry War. And so with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Melinda, who's going to talk with you a little bit about the Lowry War. And so, Melinda, do you want me to move forward with the slides that show the places and the people?
Yeah, would you just show us the next one?
Okay.
And what we learned from the Lowry War, we could, like Lawrence said, we could spend 3 days, like literally talking about this topic because there is so much to know. But one of the key ideas to take away is that, as Nancy said, the tensions were so high, and the actions involved in this war taken by Henry Berry, but also his surviving brothers. So after March 1865, he no longer had his eldest brother, William, but he had his brothers Steve and Tom. He had his brothers-in-law. He got married actually at the end of 1865 to a woman named Rhoda Strong. And Rhoda's brothers joined the Lowry gang, as well as three neighbors, one young white man and two young black men, two men who we believe had essentially freed themselves. They had been enslaved, and they escaped slavery, wound up in the swamps of Robeson County, and joined the Lowry gang from their standpoint as having emancipated themselves. And so this assemblage, this group of people took these extreme actions, as Lawrence said, because we have one conflict ending and another conflict beginning. If I just think, for example, about what we've been through as a community in the last year and a half, it's a somewhat similar, environment where there are levels of crisis that are beyond anyone's understanding or anybody's ability to do very much about, and our people are suffering. And so especially after the death of Allen and William Lowry at the hands of the Home Guard, a mob of 100 or so people was responsible for executing them. This group of men united in a way that they had not had to before, and began to engage in a campaign to take revenge on the members of that Home Guard that had executed Allen and William Lowry. If you go back to the previous slide, you just sort of get a sense of where some of these conflicts took place. The towns, the communities that are underlined there in red are all places where Henry Berry Lowry and members of the gang were active in either accomplishing the revenge that they sought, or, as some of our oral history tells us, in providing in new ways for their Lumbee and Black and poor white community members. The Civil War was a starving time, and the end of the war did not bring about the end of starvation. And when some people in the community, particularly wealthy white landowners, had more than enough, I think Henry Berry and others took it upon themselves to redistribute that wealth essentially to people who did not have. And so the locations on this map highlight some of the places where they were operating, not only to exact revenge for the deaths of Allen and William Lowry, but also to redistribute some of this wealth that was unfairly distributed in the first place. One of the places to help sort of tie this time period, this history together for y'all, I just want to highlight, if you look at sort of the center portion of the map, just to the left of the town of Lumberton, you see Scuffle T. So that's sort of the general area that Lawrence referred to earlier in Scuffletown. What outsiders called our community was Scuffletown. And then you also see Back Swamp, a place that going back to before the American Revolution had been a site of resistance in certain kinds of ways. And so the Lowry gang was operating from this standpoint, or this long tradition of resistance to the imposition of outsiders. In the case of the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction, that imposition was a political contest, which after 1835, they had no say-so in, or no ability to participate in. The Constitution of 1835, as Nancy said, had taken away the right of Native people to vote in Robeson County. And that right was not restored until the North Carolina Constitution of 1868 that restored or offered the right to vote to emancipated people for the first time. So at that point, that's when Lumbee people really got the chance to have a say-so in the political structure that had established itself on their land. During this period between 1865, when Allen and William were killed, in 1868, that was the period in which the I would say, I guess, the revenge was most active. When if there are two parts of this story, one is a kind of revenge story and another is a resistance story, then it's during that period between 1865 and 1868 that the Lowry gang was most active in enacting its revenge in locations like this one, like these on the map. The other interesting thing about this map is that it starts to hint at the political reconfiguration of North Carolina during Reconstruction. So Lumberton then was the county seat. It's still the county seat. But some of the other prominent communities in 1865 or the 1872, when this map was created, like Red Banks, for example. Red Banks is not now a town. Red Banks was a railroad stop, and now it's a farming community outside the town of Pembroke. Pembroke was a town that was essentially founded after the 1880s, many years after the Lowrie War, as a native community, as eventually a native-run community. And so one of the legacies of Henry Berry Lowry's actions at this time was to kind of reshape this map and make sure that Native people had a much more visible presence on it. Today, that visible presence is represented by the town of Pembroke, and the prominent communities in 1872, like Philadelphus, like Shoe Hill, which is now Maxton, Red Banks, and others they are not prominent locations of power in Robeson County now. The prominent location of power outside of Lumberton is really Pembroke, which is an Indian run place, Indian occupied place. And so then if you would go back, Lawrence, to the other slide of the gang members, what we see here, and Nancy, I would love for you to talk about this a little bit. What we see here is a kin network, a group of related people who were not only united because Henry Berry and Steve's and Tom's father and brother were killed, but they're also united by blood relationship. Henderson Oxendine and Calvin Oxendine. Henderson is my great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. His brother Calvin were first cousins of Henry Berry and Steve and Tom. Their mothers were sisters. And that's an incredibly important relationship in the Lumbee community, getting back to women, is, when you are related through your mother's line, that presents a certain kind of bond in the family that is unique and is unlike other kinds of bonds. So when Lumbee people look at this group of men, we see not so much a band of outlaws, we see a family group. And we also know, for example, that George Applewhite was married to Calvin and Henderson's sister. So there is another sort of set of family ties that are really bonded by women and the relationships that women have to one another that create the sort of the impetus, but also give these men the resources that they needed to carry out this campaign against those who murdered Allen and William Lowry. I'll just say one more thing, and then Nancy, ask you to sort of talk about how the museum is really working to create and make sure the legacy of this time period lasts. I will just say that, the resistance part of the story was, as I said, a resistance to outsiders' ideas about power being imposed on Lumbee people. It was also a resistance in a very important way to how conservative Democrats, so at that time, the Democrats proudly proclaimed themselves as the party of white supremacy. And the Democratic Party was sort of inherited the Confederate cause, essentially. So right after the Civil War, the Democrats were trying to regain control in Robeson County, all in the state of North Carolina. And so Reconstruction was a contest between people who had lost the war, but were still very much in place and still very much owning property and other kinds of things, had a lot of power, and a Republican Party and a Republican agenda that was gaining strength, gaining ground nationally, in part because newly emancipated people were supporting them, were voting for them. And so Henry Berry's work to resist this imposition was also had a meaningful part to play in the way that Reconstruction unfolded in North Carolina. Republicans in lots of ways lost ground in North Carolina during the 1860s and 1870s because they couldn't make up their minds about how to deal with the Lowry gang. Republicans had created a political platform around being opposed to the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist violence. They knew that the Lowry gang was not practicing the same kind of white supremacist violence that the Ku Klux Klan was practicing, but they wanted to put out their kind of law and order reputation that would rein in and control any kind of political or otherwise resistance to the powers that be. So the Republican Party divided essentially into sort of two camps as it related to the Lowry War. People who supported the cause that Henry Berry and others were fighting for, this cause of resistance, and knew that a lot of voters, Black and Native voters, were rallying also behind Henry Berry Lowry. And there was a group of Republicans that supported them and those voters, and there was a group of Republicans that rejected the idea of a group of non-white people asserting their interests in this fashion. And so the Republican Party began to lose ground essentially throughout Reconstruction, in part because of the tactics and the sort of overall political meaning of the Lowrie War and of Henry Berry's actions. So Nancy, would you talk a little bit more about things that the museum is doing and other work that you're involved in Robeson County around the legacy of the war?
Yeah, and I know that we're almost out of time, but just that we try to unpack that story as best we can, right? And that's the part about history, is interpreting what it means to us as living, breathing people today. Like, how can we connect to it? What does it mean? What is the legacy? There is an outdoor drama called Strike at the Wind that really kind of reconstructed this hero figure for Lumbee people to really cling to, right? That have left us some kind of stepping stones to adhere to for perseverance, kind of that grit and determination and exceeding kind of maybe some challenging circumstances at times. But I think for today, just we try to, one, tell the story. People are coming to the museum, and so we do, as part of our interpretation, tell a lot of the fantastic antics that Henry did. We talk about that. There's a lot of things that he was able to escape and get away from that really didn't make sense. We really try to help to better tell Rhoda's story and how really position her as part of the gang as well. And so, yeah, and public programming, and Fort Fisher is a big part of that. We curated a small exhibition at Fort Fisher, which is talking about conscription. And one of my favorite pieces, and I'll close with this, other than saying, please come out and visit us, and then, we'll teach you more and share more with you, and definitely continue to do public programs. But one of my favorite parts of this exhibition is that we sourced two rifles, and one of them is a Spencer rifle, and I forget the other kind. It's a custom rifle, and it might even be a shotgun. My terminology is off on gun lingo, so I might have it completely wrong. But the important part is that these two guns are kind of facing each other in this display, and they represent a spectrum. So one of the guns comes from Bennettsville, and it was from an enslaved person. And the way Henry kind of moved throughout the landscape, and people said they were like ghosts. They were nowhere and everywhere at the same time, right? They would pop on a scene, and whatever the action was or whatever their goal was, they enacted it, and then they were gone just as fast as they came. But the way they did this is because people would have loaded guns at locations all over, within about 100+ mile radius. They would drop off unloaded guns, pick up loaded guns. That way they didn't have to be loaded down with so much equipment and ammunition. But one of the guns comes from Bennettsville from an enslaved person, right, who's taken an extreme risk, because this was prior to emancipation, that the gun was sourced. And the other comes from a physician, where Henry paid for medical treatment from an injury that he suffered with this Spencer rifle. So what these guns do together is create this spectrum of people that supported the cause that the gang was fighting for, right? Which really was about social injustice, racism, the poverty that was going on here, the marginalization of people. And they did this in a way that they felt was most effective, and it was very effective. And the legacy of that is, for good or bad, and this could be another program, is that our community gained a reputation over time to not mess with Native people in this community, which is a complete paradigm shift from before, right? And it also gave us a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of breath to explore opportunities like education, especially when freedmen's schools were opened after emancipation. It gave audience by little Alan and Wesley's father standing on the steps of the courthouse wailing and crying about the injustice. And he kind of lays out, really, the whole example that I shared is inspired by George Lowry, of saying, we've been exceptional among the community. We've been neighbors. Our families are intermarried together. We come from Virginia. We've been part of the same migration. And for my sons to be murdered and justice not be served is just a complete affront to us. And so I could go on and on. I'll stop there, but it's just an exceptional story. There's a lot to explore here. These people made radical change. I was going to say that Hamilton McMillan heard that story, heard that plea, made his own kind of connections, but it did create a way to create even UNCP as one of the positive outcomes from the Lowrie War. It was a very difficult time. It's hard for us to wrap our heads and our hearts around what people went through. Like Melinda, the Lowries are my grandparents. Alan Lowry is my 4 times great grandfather. So when we tell this story at the museum, and this goes for the majority of us, Lawrence as well, we're not only telling a tribal story, we're telling our own family story, but most of all, we're telling an American history story. This is North Carolina's history, and this is North Carolina's story. And wherever our platform is, from Emory, from UNCP, from this museum, from our front porches, among folks that we engage with in other places, Fort Fisher, among friends, this is the story that we're telling. It is our collective history.
Wow. Nancy Fields, thank you so much for that awesome conclusion. Thank you to all of our panelists, Dr. Lawrence Locklear, Dr. Melinda Maynor Lowry, and Nancy Strickland Fields. Thank you so much. This has been awesome. And the good news is people are giving us tons of questions. Lots of questions, very little time. So what we will do, and I'm speaking to our audience, is we're going to ask a few questions. I've tried to consolidate some of them. And as a former middle school and high school teacher, I would say there's no such thing as a stupid question, but sometimes the question may be corrected. So sometimes we have to put the questions in perspective and talk about the problem of the question and then get to the meat of it. So I think all of my panelists understand that with all the questions I'm sure they get in their jobs regarding understanding American Indian, North Carolina American Indian, Indigenous history. So we're going to jump to it. The main question I want to ask first is, can you talk to us briefly about the images of Henry Berry Lowrie? That's one of the more controversial sort of hot topic questions about who he was from a phenotypic standpoint, and do we have actual images of him? So can you speak to that? I know we saw them in the presentation, but can you speak to that quickly?
Go for it, Lawrence.
What was that?
I was hoping Melinda would jump on that one.
Oh, okay.
So there's some discussion in the community about the photo of Henry Berry Lowrie, the one that I showed earlier, because Henry would have been about 20 years old when the Lowry War started. And if you look at that gentleman in the photo, he looks like a much older gentleman. So the photos that have been used to represent Henry Berry Lowrie over the years have been pretty consistent. They've shown him with this beard and black hair, and the Lowry family has used this photo for a very long time, the one that I showed you. But some folks argue that it's a photo of, I can't remember his first name. He was a Godwin gentleman from the Lumbee community. And so there's differing opinions on whether it is Henry, whether it is not Henry. We do have photos of Henry's brothers, and we do have photos of a son and daughters of Henry Berry Lowrie. So we know what they look like, but the photo of him depends on who you're talking with.
Well, let me jump in because she said phenotypic. So we get this all the time, meaning they don't look Indian, right? Let's just jump right to it. So again, going back to what Melinda said, even going back further, Native peoples, and there's no like exclusive single narrative, but there was intermarriage among Scottish and English, and there were different reasons. One of which is this really, which I'm working on my PhD about, that's about to drive me crazy, but indentured servants and white women having children with Native peoples, and then how that factored into free labor in Virginia. There is a really complicated colonial history there. So yeah, there were mixed blood people, and Henry Berry Lowrie was a mixed blood person, right? Which kind of maybe even made them feel a little more privileged that they were lighter skinned or looked in a different way, that to say, hey, why are you making me sit in the balcony of the church? Or here I was able to fight in the Revolutionary War. We see that play out differently in the Civil War, where we weren't able to fight in the Civil War, but some of the lighter skinned folks did. They went to South Carolina and they passed. So yes, phenotypically, it's not your stereotypical, he's not a stereotypical plains looking Indian gentleman, but he lived among a Native community. He identified as a Native person. He followed a matrilineal society in his mother's line. So by all intents and purposes, he was a Native man.
Yes. And thank you for that, Ms. Fields, because I think that speaks to culture as opposed to appearances, which I think is what we should be talking about more in terms of what it means to be an American Indian or Native person, and including that in part of our education.
And I think that gets to a larger point about DNA. A lot of folks assume because I may have Native DNA that makes me Native, but again, it gets back to that point about culture. Culture is really what defines you and shapes you. It's that worldview, and that's how someone's Indianness is determined. It's not by their phenotype.
Right. Next question, and this is a pretty simple question, but we've got lots of educators that are joining us tonight, and people all across who are very interested in Reconstruction history, which I think you all would agree that most Americans need a little bit more of, in terms of that movement between the Civil War and Reconstruction. Can you give us a definitive explanation regarding conscription versus being drafted? And if those two terms have generational sort of meanings, and to what extent does being conscripted lend itself to the suggestion of a form of enslavement or not? Can we talk about those two terms and explain that to our audience?
Let me try to do that quickly, and then I'm sorry, my dog is like whining, so that's what you hear. I'll try to do that quickly, and then if Nancy or Lawrence, if you want to build on that, hush. In the Civil War context, I'm not aware, a draft is something that you register for. You sign up to be drafted. There's a law that's passed that requires you to sign up. But when you are drafted into the Army, your name is called from a registry that you voluntarily, in order to comply with the law, added your name to. Conscription in the Civil War context is basically the equivalent of kidnapping.
Okay.
So you can be forced, compelled by law to serve without ever having voluntarily done anything in order to comply with the law. Conscription is a sort of a system that requires people to serve in the military. And in the Civil War context in North Carolina at this time, conscription emerged very early as a Confederate strategy to just simply recruit enough manpower to fight this very, very unpopular war. I mean, as people might know, North Carolina was the last to secede from the Union. And so there was a lot of division within the state, and Confederate leaders, when it came time to make that fateful call, decided that conscription was going to be really the primary method of raising manpower for that army. In the Robeson County context, it acquires a somewhat another sort of spin or unique kind of character, because Lumbee people were not allowed to, by law, to own weapons except with a special permit. So if we were signing up for the Confederacy, it was because we were passing as something else, is because we had essentially left our cultural context and decided to go be someone else, claim that we were someone else. Our inability to own weapons and be who we were meant that we occupied a kind of ambiguous status legally that then made it very easy to take what might have been a reasonable expectation for conscription and totally abuse it. And so the Home Guard then becomes the primary sort of law enforcement agency enforcing conscription in Robeson County. That's not the case everywhere in the Civil War, all throughout the South. But it is part of what makes our history the way it is.
Thank you for that. Anyone else want to add to that? I think that's a great explanation. If we have, I think we have a few more minutes. The next question is specifically for educators. We had a few folks who chimed in, and Dr. Locklear, we talked about this earlier. In terms for educators, can you all briefly talk about what are the consistent myths that you would love as educators to dispel regarding specifically American Indians or Native folks in North Carolina or at large, as it pertains to helping people understand the contributions and the cultural aspects of American Indians in the state? That's a very broad question to give you the opportunity to share what you wish people knew as you're speaking to public audiences.
We're working on a curriculum here at the museum to fill in the gaps. We did some listening sessions with teachers a couple of years ago across the state and for the State Social Studies Conference. And I think that one of the big things for teachers is to listen to what we're saying when we're telling our stories. Being able to situate our stories and experiences like this very one that we're talking about within the context of Southern and American history, right? Native people don't have to be this bubble that's kind of floating out separate from the American experience. And also to understand that the South, as we're talking about, the period of Reconstruction that you brought up, is not just black and white. And Native peoples did not disappear in 1800. We're still here. And even though the representations of our culture a lot of times is in a kind of a presentation format of powwow, where you see singing and dancing and traditional regalia, that's not all that Native people are. So really finding creative ways to reach out to community. Museums are great resources for educational materials. A lot of teachers don't know that pretty much every museum, including you guys, have an educational department with education staff who create curriculum, teaching materials, outside of the box teaching aids that help tell that story. So reach out to your museums, reach out to your Native community, engage, and have an open mind about the stories that you're hearing and how to situate them. Just a quick example, one of the things that we've done is gone through the new, I don't think they got passed, but the new proposed standards that are more inquiry based. And we're looking at, when you talk about slavery, for instance. There are opportunities to talk about Native people within the constructs of slavery, who make up your community or your societies, like in some of the elementary standards. Look around, who's in your community. There are 8 tribes in North Carolina. I can guarantee you there's a tribe somewhere near you and a people that are ready to welcome teachers with open arms. So looking at the standards and not thinking of them in the traditional ways, but how can you situate Indians within those stories? Reach out to the museum. I am happy to help give you some ideas of how to do that. And we're still here. That's the other big thing. Indians have not disappeared.
Thank you. Thank you. Last question. And this was a question we received in the chat. And you all can speak to this in terms of if you've heard the term before or the phrase, I should say, and your thoughts about it or experience with it. What does it mean to be out of territory in terms of identity? Is that something that speaks to you all? I'd like to wrap up this last question for Lumbee folks and for people who are viewing tonight and give you the opportunity to talk about what that means in terms of bringing community together and where you see community from a futuristic standpoint. And if that's a term you'd like to speak to.
It's how I feel when I leave the county and drive to Charlotte, out of territory. I feel a little.
Well, I think, you know, you take Lumbee identity with you wherever you go. If you're in Detroit, Baltimore, Greensboro, if you're walking on the beach in Myrtle Beach, I mean, wherever you're at and you run into a Lumbee and we start talking and our mouths open, the Lumbee just comes out. And that's going to exist wherever you're at. But when you're talking about in terms of out of territory, I think that's more related to tribal services and getting tribal services. You can take Lumbee wherever you're at, but getting those tribal services for many of them, as far, if I'm correct, you have to live within the tribal territory to get some of those services. So I think you're talking about 2 different things there.
And I would just build on that to say that it's important that folks remember that Lumbee people are members of a racial group, but we are also members of a political community. We're citizens of a nation. And the Lumbee Nation's traditional territory is Robeson, Cumberland, Hoke, and Scotland counties. We have other communities, as we've indicated, where populations, groups of Lumbee people live, and they carry that identity where they are. In those communities, we are still citizens of the Lumbee Nation. Yes. Because we apply our ideas about home are always our ideas about where our ancestors are buried. And when folks, this idea of like Native people and land, it's not really a romantic attack, it's not like it's real. And it's real because even my daughter, who's 14 and as much of a teenager as any 14-year-old out there, she knows her ancestors going back 5 and 10 generations and where they are buried. And so that's education that we are able, I live in Atlanta now, that's education that we are able to provide our children, regardless of where we are, in part because of those adversities that we've faced. We've lost a lot over the years, but what we faced has made us stronger. And speaking about what our future is, we are well positioned to move into the 21st century, having more influence in the state of North Carolina and the United States than we've ever had. That the loss that we've endured and that we've experienced has actually made us stronger and has enabled us to grow in that attachment to our home, to our homelands, to our territories, to the places where our ancestors are buried. So we take that land, we take that home with us everywhere.
Amen. Nancy Strickland Fields, Lawrence Locklear, Melinda, Maynor, Lowry, thank you so much for your service. Thank you for educating us tonight. Thank you for enlightening us. We're certainly out of time, but not out of questions and not out of content. We know we could continue this conversation many moons over, but thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so appreciative and so humbled. And I want to thank all of my colleagues here at the North Carolina Museum of History for making this happen tonight. I want to ask everyone to stay tuned. We have 2 new programs coming up. one in October, and Dr. Lowry spoke to this earlier regarding the Tuscarora War. So we're sticking with the thematic approach, even though we may be a little out of the chronological scope, and talking more in November about American Indian education. All of this to whet the palate and the appetite for our American Indian cultural celebration coming up in November. Thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. We want you to stay safe and continue to look to the North Carolina Museum of History for your entertainment and educational needs. Thank you, everyone, and good
all.
night.